Our speaker for you Around the World with Fred is, of course, Fred Rosenbaum, an award-winning author. There are many, many books, including one of my favorites, which is Out on a Ledge. He's written Taking Risks and many others about Jewish partisans. And he's also written a very in-depth book about the Bay Area Jewish community. Fred, of course, is the founder of Lehrhaus Judaica, which became the largest adult Jewish education program in Northern California. And it continues today with New Lehrhaus. And you can see their amazing programs at newlehrhaus.org. So now we will see a trailer of Anton. Thank you.
А на это глянь. Оно как замок.
Папа говорит, что Моше там.
Я знаю, что евреев есть тоже рай.
Конечно, есть. Ты же не думаешь, что у всех людей рай одинаковый?
Anton!
Anton! Schnell ins Haus! Schnell ins Haus! Anton, Emma, weg vom Fenster!
Was ist Mama?
Когда вы убеждали богобоязненных колонистов прятать зерно, вы решали, кому жить, кому нет?
Du bist der letzte Mann in der Familie, Anton. Du sollst hier nicht zu Staub werden.
Жизнь чертовски несправедливая штука, но прожить вам ее доведется. Никто за вас это не сделает.
Он уже твой. Бери, теперь ты мой брат.
Замочите еврея, только вывезите в лес подальше.
Яш, а почему евреев не любят?
И время для эмоций. Время крушить и строить.
А время любить.
А есть у немцев отдельный рай? Что получается, когда я умру? То никогда не увижу тебя? Зачем мне такой рай?
Какой-то дурацкий рай, если там нету друзей. Тебя.
Уходи отсюда, я тебе говорю!
Lass ihn in Ruhe! Lass ihn!
Anton trägt seinen Kopf noch in den Wolken.
Okay, can we begin now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so Anton is set in 1919 at the peak of the catastrophic 4-year-long civil war following the Russian Revolution of 1917. Takes place in the region close to the Black Sea, near Odessa, where some of the most destructive bombing and fiercest fighting of the current Ukrainian-Russian war is now raging. Let's take a look at the map and I'll explain this further. You see, the film is set there at in the southern coast, central southern coast. I'd like everyone to take a look at Odessa. That's really one of the most important cities in modern Jewish history. It was the most cosmopolitan city in all of Eastern Europe. Also a magnificent place with beautiful 19th century architecture. It's known for its culture, especially its music. And if you look just a little bit to the east of that, you see Kherson. And many of you recall just 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainians were able to retake that from the Russians, although it's being bombed heavily because the front is just a little bit to the east of that. Moving back toward the west, look at Mykolaiv. That's another city that's been in the news so much. because it's had to endure this terrible bombing that's been taking place really since February of this year. It's from the film, the place that it's actually set, the precise place is not mentioned, but in the novel it is. And where it is just a little bit north and west of Odessa. That's right there is where this rural hamlet, is where the film is set. Okay. By the way, Odessa is being bombed right now, tonight, just as we speak. Right. Okay, thank you. We can remove that map. Now, then, a century ago, as now, Ukraine was struggling for survival against the Russians. Then, as now, the plentiful grain, coal, and iron of the region was coveted by a rapacious dictator, resulting in mass killings, injuries, rapes, untold plunder, millions of refugees. This connection between the Bolsheviks of 1919, which you see in the film, and Putin today, that was likely in the mind of the filmmaker, Zaza Urashadze, the director and co-author of the screenplay in 2019. Let's look at the next slide. Sadly, he died of a heart attack at age 54, soon after the film was released. He made the movie before the full-scale invasion, which Russia launched last February, but he witnessed the seizure of Crimea by the Kremlin and the hybrid war, as it is known, from 2014 on, when Putin sent masked soldiers in unmarked military uniforms to fight alongside pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. 15,000 were killed in that conflict before 2022. No doubt, Urashadze was also outraged by Putin's ferocious bombing campaign against Chechnya and the barbaric invasion of his own country of Georgia in 2008. Both Chechnya and Georgia, like Ukraine, former Soviet socialist republics that became independent after the collapse of communism, but which Moscow has still sought to dominate with force of arms. Well, Urashadze's earlier movie, Tangerines, was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Film. It depicts Russian troops, along with Chechen mercenaries, ruthlessly trying to nip Georgian independence in the bud in 1992. He grew up when Georgia was part of the USSR, as I just mentioned, and no doubt recalled the communist repression during his youth. His parents had memories of even more oppressive Soviet totalitarianism, the regime of the 1950s. His grandparents could tell him of the devastating famine of the early 1930s, engineered by Stalin, in which about 4 million people died of starvation, mostly in Ukraine, but elsewhere in the Soviet Union as well. Okay, we can remove that slide, thank you. Now, to me, this film stands as a ringing denunciation of Russia's violent expansionism, whether led by the czars, the Soviets, or Putin. Throughout virtually all of Russian history, one sees contempt for individual freedom, with the state denying the rights of the overwhelming majority of its people, while also trying to subjugate its neighbors. Anton, set during an especially disastrous period of the Kremlin's centuries-long assault on Ukraine. Well, the film can be complicated. There's a whirlwind of war, revolution, ethnic and religious conflict, shifting borders, regime change, and a tremendous clash of 4 internal armies and 5 foreign armies, each with opposing war aims. So that's why Riva and I thought, this talk ought to be presented even before you see the film. Now, let me clear up one enigma at the outset. At the center of the film is the close friendship of the 2 boys, one Jewish and one German. The 2 youngsters speak Russian to each other, but we can hear, even in the trailer, the unaccented High German spoken by the child and his family. What are they doing in southern Ukraine? They are among hundreds of thousands of German colonists whose forebears settled in the region more than a century earlier and who kept intact their language, folk customs, cuisine, and religion, usually Mennonite, which is similar to the Amish, but some, like Anton's family, were Catholic. Let's look at the next slide, please. No, the one before that, please. No? Okay. Well, maybe it's the one after that. Maybe there's, keep going. Yes, that's the slide I'd like, please. Okay. Their unlikely story is told in the novel Anton, written in 2008 by Dale Eisler, who you see here. He is a descendant of these German colonists. Now he lives in Saskatchewan, where many of them immigrated once communism took hold. And if you look at the map below, you can see in that same region where the film is set, the very high concentration of these German colonists, in some places up to 13 to 15% of the total population. Okay, we can remove that slide now. Thank you. Now, the large settlement of Black Sea Germans, as they are known, began in the late 18th century under the reign of Catherine the Great, herself a German princess before ascending to the Russian throne. She conquered southern Ukraine and Crimea from the Ottoman Turks. So it's only in the 1790s that this region became part of the growing Tsarist empire. Seeking to modernize backward Russia, Catherine understood the potential value of Ukraine, but saw that its methods of farming the rich soil were primitive, in fact, medieval. So she lured experienced German farmers with the offer of free tracts of land, expecting them to make the uniquely fertile Black Earth much more productive. This would feed the new cities she established, such as Odessa, Kherson, and Mykolaiv. And the German agriculturalists would also serve as models for the Ukrainian peasants. It's remarkable how little the German colonists assimilated into their host society. Over the generations, they prospered, but considered Germany their fatherland. They gave up nothing of their Teutonic culture. They named many of their settlements after German cities and towns. In the film, you'll hear a reference several times to Mannheim, Baden, and the like. These refer not to places in Germany, but rather nearby colonies close to the Black Sea. In the Russian Civil War, this group was vulnerable to attack from each of the many warring sides. They had been under enormous pressure even earlier, from 1914 on, when Germany attacked and occupied much of Ukraine during World War I. They were hated as ethnic Germans and suspected of spying and sabotage. After the revolution, the German colonists feared most of all the Bolsheviks, who threatened everything they had built up over more than a century. Their land would be taken from them. They would be forced to toil on giant collective farms. Their religious life would be crippled, if not crushed, by the atheistic Soviets. Their language would be banned, their culture destroyed. As it turned out, 10% of the Black Sea Germans were killed in the Civil War, about the same percentage deported to Siberia. The large majority of those remaining by 1920, like the family of the novelist Dale Eisler, they immigrated to Canada. The film portrays the family of another imperiled minority group that fared even worse, the Jews, also savagely attacked by all sides. They too had been invited to Ukraine in the early 19th century by the czars, who thought their skill as artisans and tradesmen would boost this undeveloped part of the empire. And a mass migration of Jews began. By the late 19th century, there were 3 million Jews in Ukraine, about a third of all European Jewry in Ukraine. Now, around half immigrated to the United States and elsewhere. And I would bet that many of the people participating tonight can trace their ancestry to a shtetl in Ukraine, although at that time it was part of the Tsarist Empire. But during the Russian Revolution, there still were 1.5 million Jews in Ukraine, mostly in large cities, such as Odessa, which was 1/3 Jewish, and of course in shtetls across the countryside. There had been dreadful riots against Jews in southern Ukraine since the infamous Kishinev pogrom of 1881. But far worse was the decimation in the wake of the Russian Revolution during this civil war that we're focusing on. It's estimated that about 50,000 Ukrainian Jews were murdered in this frenzy of violence, more than twice that number in Russia as a whole. The Jewish family in this film is among the victims of that catastrophe. This was the most horrendous mass killing of Jews until the Shoah. A leading historian has recently argued that the pogroms of 1919 were actually the onset of the Holocaust, a prototype of the Nazi Einsatzgruppen with the help of Ukrainians who went from shtetl to shtetl and massacred Jews. Now, it would, of course, this was far less systematic than the final solution, but a kind of rehearsal for genocide nonetheless. Let's look at the next image. That's it. Look at this haunting newspaper report in the United States in 1919. These were, the article focuses on a mass meeting of Americans who were trying to aid the Ukrainians during these pogroms. It says Lansing gives permission. He was Secretary of State then under Wilson. But look at the last 3 lines of this. To me, this is just chilling. Mass meeting hears that 127,000 Jews have been killed and 6 million are in peril. This is written in 1919. Okay, we can remove that now. Thank you. Jews were targeted for a myriad of reasons. As you all know, since the Middle Ages, they were accused of killing Jesus and of the most hideous crimes, such as using the blood of Christian babies to make matzahs. And this kind of anti-Judaism is even stronger in Russian Orthodoxy than it is in Catholicism. Second, many peasants encountered Jews as managers and middlemen for wealthy landowners, an economic role that caused great resentment, especially in times of shortages. Third, and there's more than a grain of truth to this accusation, Jews were thought to be disloyal to the Tsar and his army. They were, but this was a grave accusation during wartime. But what sets the Civil War period apart is the most incendiary vilification of all. That Bolshevism, soon to be known as communism, was a Jewish plot. Most Ukrainians, for the same reasons as the German colonists, were terrified of a Red Army victory. They would lose everything: their property, their church, their language, their way of life. Even worse, they stood to be killed or deported. Ukrainians, pointing to Leon Trotsky, born Lev Bronstein, and several other prominent Bolshevik Jews, blamed this mortal threat on all Jews. Now, in fact, the large majority of Ukrainian Jews, especially the Orthodox and the Hasidim, but also businessmen, large and small, they were staunchly opposed to Bolshevism. Yet the looters, rapists, and killers made no distinction. If you were a Jew, you were a Red. Let us now try to understand the main belligerents of this civil war that killed 12 million people throughout Russia and destroyed the rural hamlet in which the film is set. As you know, during the terrible deprivation of World War I, the Romanov dynasty, absolute monarchs for over 3 centuries, was overthrown, first in February 1917 by a democratic socialist movement led by Alexander Kerensky. Let's look at the next slide, please. But in October of 1917, the small yet highly disciplined Red Army was able to oust the Mensheviks, as they were known, by capturing Petrograd, Moscow, and other big cities. Take a look at this picture of Lenin. I think this shows you the intensity of this leader. And there he is below, haranguing the crowds. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, thank you. The Bolsheviks knew they would have to fight to the death in order to extend their rule throughout the vast Russian Empire, and realized they could not hold the Baltics. With Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia declared independence from Russia, they would gain their sovereignty, as would Finland. Lenin and Trotsky fought furiously against Poland, but in the end, they had to cede large territories to the Poles. So the new USSR would be a shrunken country compared to Tsarist Russia. But the Bolsheviks absolutely refused to give up populous Ukraine, a storehouse of raw materials and a gateway to the Black Sea. That is why Trotsky himself came to Ukraine in 1919, as the film shows, to take command of this critical front, although his adventures portrayed in the movie are fictional. Let's take a look at these posters. Now, I'm going to be showing a number of posters tonight, and I just want you to realize the importance of these images at the time. This is obviously a period in which there's no radio, there's no TV, there are no movies, there's no internet. There are newspapers, but much of the population is illiterate. So it's these images on posters that are absolutely vital in terms of influencing people. Now, the poster on the left, you see this trying to inspire people to Lenin's cause, and it says, "Communist revolution is inevitable." And then on the right, you see a Lenin sweeping the earth of all evil. And the caption says, "Lenin cleanses the earth of filth, clergy, monarchists, capitalists." So this is the way they tried to attract their followers. Let's look at the next slide. The Bolsheviks' main enemy was the whites. In the film, there's one encounter with a soldier of the whites. This is an army that inherited much of the Tsar's officer corps, and they were determined to eradicate the Reds and save Russia, as they put it. They were monarchists who wanted to reinstate the Romanov dynasty. And if you look at their general, their leader, Anton, he looks a little bit like Tsar Nicholas II, and is certainly dressed in that way. Now, the last Tsar, as I mentioned, this Nicholas II, he had been executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918, along with his wife and 5 children. But that hardly deterred the whites from seeking to put another Romanov on the throne. Had the fight simply been between the whites and the Reds, the whites might have won the Russian Civil War, destroyed communism, and completely changed the course of 20th century world history. Now let's look at the next slide. Let's look at some of their posters. Now, these General Denikin and his men were obsessed with anti-Semitism. They blamed the Russian Revolution almost entirely on a diabolical secret society of Jews. Take a look at this image. You see at the very, very top, there are names in Cyrillic alphabet, and they correspond to these figures in the film that are about to stab to death as some kind of sacrifice, Mother Russia. Trotsky is the one holding the knife. You just look at the caricatures of these people. All of these are prominent Jews among the Bolshevik leadership. There's the one on the far right is Karl Radek. The one just to the left of that is Lev Kamenev, who is Trotsky's brother-in-law. You see Lenin, of course, in the red cape. And I mean, no need for me to mention all these others, but all of these are Jewish. Look at the man holding the bag with the number 30 on it. Of course, that's the 30 pieces of silver for which Jesus was betrayed. And even in the lower left corner, you see the Red Army portrayed as Asiatics, which is yet another slur. But the main thing here is that it's the Jews who are putting into motion this terrible Bolshevik menace that's going to kill Russia. In fact, when America and Britain ultimately cut their modest support to the whites. General Denikin and his followers, the whites, claimed Wilson and Prime Minister David Lloyd George were Jews who were part of the Bolshevik cabal. We Americans are all too familiar with wild conspiracy theories. This was an early 20th century version. By the way, this is the army in the Civil War, the whites, that Putin identifies with today, the Tsarists. During the Soviet period, these counter-revolutionary whites were naturally considered the embodiment of evil. But in the last 20 years, Putin has rehabilitated General Denikin and his men as national heroes by putting up statues and memorials to them and by revising textbooks. Now let's go to the image just below. The White Army included bands of fearsome Cossacks who centuries earlier were nomadic warriors bent on plunder, who perpetrated the Khmelnytsky massacres, a calamitous series of pogroms in the mid-1600s. They'd become settled on the land by the 19th century, but retained their skills as armed horsemen, and many continued to be brigands and bloodthirsty Jew haters. Okay, let's look at the next image. Of special interest to us today is the Ukrainian nationalist movement at this time, much like that of 1991, seeking to form an independent country in the wake of an empire's collapse. That time, of course, it was a collapse of the Tsarist Empire. 1991, they tried to form an independent state after the collapse of communism and the unraveling of the Soviet Union. Now, this goal of independence obviously was antithetical both to the Reds and the Whites, who wanted to keep Ukraine in their respective realms. Idealistic democratic socialists proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic January 1918, seeking a multicultural, multilingual state in which Yiddish would be an official language along with Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish. The head of that democracy had a Jewish wife. To me, this is the antecedent of Zelensky's vision of Ukraine today. In fact, the flag of 1918, a broad blue stripe above a broad yellow stripe, is the same we've seen so often this year. It stands for a wheat field below a blue sky. Now, the tragedy of the nationalist movement during the Russian Civil War was that the Social Democrats were swept aside by a dictatorial general who you see here, Simon Petlura. Under his leadership, the nationalists became xenophobic, intolerant of anyone other than ethnic Ukrainians, no less monstrous than the Reds or the Whites. Still, Ukrainians today regard him, Petlura, as a great patriot, and there are statues of him all over the country. This is deeply disturbing because his troops were vicious anti-Semites who murdered more Jews than any army in this war, which is really saying a lot. The name Petlura would be forever cursed in Jewish circles. And in 1926, he was assassinated in Paris by Sholem Schwarzbart, who had lost 15 members of his family in the pogroms. And for that reason, Schwarzbart was acquitted of murder by a sympathetic French jury. Okay, let's look at the next one. Taking up arms against these three powerful armies in Ukraine was that of Nestor Makhno, whose troops, primarily peasants, demanded no state authority at all. He proudly called himself an anarchist, and he flew the black anarchist flag. Also carried out anti-Jewish atrocities. Okay, let's look at just the final image there on that, a little bit larger. No, one back. That's it. You see that the peasant army there, that's a rendition of the way they would march with scythes or pitchforks, and this is obviously a positive book, Ukrainian Freedom Fighter, but he was actually an anarchist, and these people showed no mercy to Jews or anyone else. Okay, we can remove this set of slides. Okay, thank you. Now, as if this four-sided bloodbath, right? The Reds, the Whites, the Nationalists, and the Anarchists, as if this weren't enough, there were numerous local warlords bent on pillage and assault and just taking advantage of the complete breakdown of law and order. And then there were the foreign invaders. The German army occupied much of Ukraine as late as spring of 1918. Sounds counterintuitive, but Jews and many others were actually sorry to see them depart because they were far more disciplined than the warring internal armies. And they kept the peace in Kyiv in particular. At the end of 1918, the French Navy landed in Odessa and occupied that city and other Black Sea ports for 3 months. But the most consequential foreign attack was that of the new country of Poland. They conquered vast territories in Western Ukraine, including Lviv. And they massacred thousands of Jews in the process. The Poles, having just achieved their own independence after a century and a half of being ruled by others, were dead set against an ethnic and religious group, the Jews, that they associated both with Christ killers and with Bolshevism. Even the British and the Americans intervened to, as Winston Churchill said, strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. Churchill was then Minister of Defense. There were about 200,000 foreign soldiers in the newly born Soviet Union, and the fear of invasion by Western powers has remained in the Russian collective consciousness to this day. This fear of Western invasion has even reached paranoia. To sum up, Ukraine in 1919 was engulfed in something more than chaos. It experienced the total collapse of authority. Kyiv violently changed hands 5 times in less than a year, 14 times during the Civil War. All you could do is flee or stay and try to protect yourself and your family. Jews did form armed guards for self-defense. This might have been effective against local civilians who had perpetrated past pogroms. But in 1919, Jewish militias were no match for the marauding armies that attacked them. Let us focus, as the film does, on the Red Army, commanded by Leon Trotsky, a main character in the movie. As an intellectual, as a Jew, as an internationalist rather than a Russian nationalist, we often think of him as somewhat more moderate than Lenin or Stalin. The film, though, makes him into a monster, a single-minded butcher of anyone even suspected of being anti-Bolshevik. And that portrayal is quite accurate. especially during the Russian Civil War. For the sake of winning this fateful struggle, he and Lenin put aside all moral concerns and resorted to every kind of terror, hostage taking, mass executions, rape and torture, forced conscription, slave labor camps. As early as 1917, they formed a dreaded secret police, the Cheka, the forerunner of the KGB. Another main character in the film and another Jew, Commissar Dora, whom you saw in the trailer, drawn from real life, is no less a heartless executioner than Trotsky, her lover. In fact, leading scholars argue that this web of tyranny imposed by the Bolsheviks during the Civil War laid the foundations for the totalitarian Soviet state for the next 70 years and the Putin regime after that. The Bolsheviks were not overtly anti-Semitic, as were their enemies. They did not ride into a town and shout, death to the Yids, save Russia. But historians estimate that they accounted for 10% of the deaths in the pogroms. That's because they robbed and murdered property owners, including small businessmen who were disproportionately Jewish. Their war cry was, steal what has already been stolen. Meaning, the bourgeoisie had exploited the workers to become wealthy. So now it's time to turn the tables. Worse, in order to fight their archenemy, the whites, Trotsky sometimes forged an alliance with the Cossacks. I mentioned earlier, sadistic raiders whose prime victims for centuries were Jews. Who was Trotsky, who led the Red Army in this victory, but blood-soaked victory? Let's look at the next slide. Here is an image of the young Trotsky. This is from the cover of the book that I feel is the best biography of Trotsky by the British historian Robert Service. And here he is as a young man. Now, if you just look at him in this photo, he does seem to have a soft, sensitive face. You know, I think I saw people like this, let's say graduate students in political science at Berkeley in the late 1960s. He was born and raised in this same region of southern Ukraine, near Odessa. He never denied his Jewish origins, but his upbringing was atypical for Jews in late 19th century Russia. His parents were prosperous landowners and were quite secular. They sent him to a well-regarded Catholic boarding school in Odessa for his education. His first wife was Jewish, and the wedding was performed by a rabbi. But Trotsky was a lifelong atheist and not only rejected Judaism, but also repudiated any notion of Jewish peoplehood. He adamantly opposed Zionism, as we'd expect, but also Bundism, the movement that was Marxist, but envisioned a semi-autonomous Yiddish-speaking community in Russia. Indeed, the only distinction Trotsky saw among people was class, rich versus poor, the workers versus the owners of the means of production. He embraced Leninism even before he was 20 and was imprisoned for 4 years in Ukraine and Siberia for his revolutionary activities. After his escape, he spent 15 years in exile as a hard-hitting writer and mesmerizing speaker, and was a leading figure at party congresses held outside Russia. He lived mostly in Vienna, but also London, Paris, and even in the US, where he had an apartment in the Bronx. From there, He returned to Russia in 1917. Let's scroll down. He quickly became second only to Lenin. And here he is, not quite 40. With a newfound talent of military tactician, he took over command of the army and the navy in the Civil War. He was the supreme commander. No longer simply a prophet of revolution, but an armed prophet, the title of one of his biographies. Now, as you all know, it was the uncultured Stalin who succeeded Lenin. He exiled Trotsky and later had him assassinated in Mexico City in 1940, where Trotsky was having a love affair with Frida Kahlo. For the counter-revolutionaries who incited pogroms by linking Bolshevism with the Jews, Trotsky was literally the poster boy. And let's look at the next one. Next slide. Okay, maybe if you can just, that's it. Now look at this. I'm going to show you some of the venomous caricatures they employed. This is a poster that you could see, on the streets. Here he is, the Grim Reaper right behind him. He's holding a revolver. There's always that caricature of the Jewish nose. In reality, you saw the picture of Trotsky, did not have an enlarged nose. Not that it really matters, but they always tried to do that caricature, a Jewish caricature, and he's just sitting on a mound of skulls. It's really horrible. Let's look at the next one. Here he is. Here's Trotsky just whipping, poor Russian peasants. And, that slogan, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But you see behind him, it looks like two wealthy Jews, as if they are somehow behind, Trotsky's revolution. Now let's look at the next one. This poster is Trotsky's coat of arms. This is a takeoff on the Romanov dynasty czarist coat of arms, which had the double-headed eagle with the wings spread. Here you have two heads of Trotsky, and what is spread out? A talus. At the center, you see a word in the Cyrillic alphabet. That word is Talmud. And then below, Leo Trotsky's coat of arms. Okay, you can remove that now. Thank you. It's true that not only Trotsky, but several other secular Jews were Bolshevik leaders, such as his brother-in-law Lev Kamenev. These others that we saw in that other poster, Grigory Zinoviev, he was born Hirsch Appelbaum. Karl Radek was born Karl Sobelson. What interests me more, however, are the many Jews in the rank and file of the Bolshevik movement as party members and Red Army soldiers. Like others in the despotic, impoverished Tsarist empire, Jews longed for a new system to replace it. They were not welcome among the whites, Petlura's Ukrainian nationalists, or the anarchists, but they were accepted by the Bolsheviks and attracted by the promise of utopia, universal brotherhood. To win this harrowing civil war would require the utmost in self-sacrifice. And these Jews were willing to leave their families unprotected to go to the front and put their lives on the line. What explains this Jewish attraction to Bolshevism? Some historians link this age-old learning for the Messiah to their world-redeeming ideology of Marxist-Leninism. But recent scholarship is focused on a more compelling reason. These young Jews were not only rushing toward the red banner, they were also turning their backs on the traditional Judaism they had grown up with. Yes, Trotsky's parents were secular, but most of the Jewish Bolsheviks came from Orthodox communities, which they felt to be clannish, hidebound, in short, stultifying. Especially in Odessa, many of these Jewish rebels fell in love with Russian high culture, notably the great literary works of Tolstoy, Chekhov, and above all, Pushkin. These novels, plays, and poetry, filled with penetrating insights about the human condition, well, they spoke to these Jews more than the tractates of the Talmud. This was a transgressive generation that sought to break from their parents and even more so their grandparents' Judaism. And Bolshevism was an alternative. It gave them not only a noble cause, but a pathway into the Russian soul. So joining the Red Army was a form of assimilation. As one historian has put it, within the Russian Revolution, there was a Jewish revolution against Jewishness. Let's look at the next slide, please. A brilliant Jewish author of the time, from Odessa, of course, embodied this transformation. Isaac Babel. From a Yiddish-speaking religious home, he studied rabbinic texts before becoming one of the greatest Russian short story writers of the 20th century. In his mid-20s, he covered the Civil War for an Odessa newspaper as what we would call today an embedded journalist. He rode on horseback all over Ukraine with the Red Cavalry that you see above. And the Red Cavalry is the title of his classic work. He sometimes went from being a war correspondent to being a soldier himself. His brigade was made up of tough guys, including many Cossacks, whom the Bolsheviks had recruited. Babel wisely tried to hide his Jewish identity from them. So there was an odd juxtaposition. Let's look at the next, if you can scroll down to the next. A short, wiry, bespectacled intellectual riding into battle with seasoned horsemen, their sabers drawn. This cartoon, of course, comes from the New York Review of Books. There he is on his galloping steed with a typewriter. And here you see how the Red Cavalry is portrayed. These are the covers of the Red Cavalry books, where the Red Army is so powerful in crushing, big business and the church. On the left, you see how heroic this Red Cavalry seems. Now, at first, Babel was in awe of his new comrades, contrasting Jewish fragility and decay, which he saw in the devastated shtetls the Red Cavalry came upon, contrasting that with the hubris and virility of the battle-tested Russians, Ukrainians, and Cossacks. Many were illiterate, and at night, Babel would read aloud to them Lenin's speeches. He became enthralled with his macho band of brothers that one literary critic calls Babel's first love. Consider this famous passage Let's go to that, just scroll down. This is quoted many times. Just forget for a minute that you have spectacles on your nose. Stop stammering with timidity in the presence of people. Imagine for 1 second that you raise hell in public, that you're a tiger, a lion, a cat. You spend the night with a Russian woman and leave her satisfied. You're 25. If rings had been fastened to the earth and sky, you'd have seized them and pulled the sky down to earth. I think you can see his mindset at that time. Okay, we can remove that now. But then disillusion set in. Before long, he's repelled by the incessant Marxist propaganda, and more so by the unbridled cruelty he witnesses, inflicted by his own comrades. At one point, he writes, "Our way of bringing freedom? Horrible. Looting, bravado, savagery. We're in the vanguard." That's that Marxist phrase, the vanguard. We're in the vanguard. But of what? The population awaits freedom, and in ride the Cossacks, and they move like a whirlwind, hated by everyone. In his personal diary, Babel relates a rape and murder committed by the man riding alongside him every day. His searing first-person account, again, it's entitled Red Cavalry, indicates to me that the film's portrayal of the Bolshevik cutthroats is not off the mark. What happened to Isaac Babel? He was one of many Jews feverishly drawn to the revolution, who then criticized it, and who would later pay the supreme price. Stalin ordered him executed in 1940, the same year as Trotsky's assassination. Almost every one of the leading Jewish Bolsheviks met the same fate. They helped impose totalitarianism on Russia and then became its victims. Now, let me conclude by returning to the point I raised at the outset. The implicit connection the film makes between horrors inflicted on Ukraine by the Bolsheviks in 1919 and those inflicted by Putin in the past decade. Gorishadze depicts two completely opposing visions for Ukraine. One, before the Bolshevik invasion, it's that of peaceful minority groups like the Germans and the Jews, in harmony with one another, each observing their religion, expressing their culture, as shown by the friendship of the two boys and their families. In the novel, by the way, Anton's blood brother is not a Jew, but a Muslim boy, yet another vulnerable minority. The filmmaker also portrays a multilingual society with people speaking Russian, but also Ukrainian, German, Yiddish, other languages. Such tolerance can only be brought about by basic freedoms and a democratic government. That is the goal of President Zelensky today. I say goal because Ukraine is not there yet. There is still much corruption, there's sexism, some rights have been suspended due to the martial law in wartime, but Zelensky has made significant progress in creating a new Ukraine that is not only an independent country, but also a free country, gravitating toward the EU with civil liberties and for gays, for example, and other minority groups, fighting climate change. You all know that he's Jewish. This would be unimaginable in any other East European country. He won the presidency by a landslide in 2019 with 73% of the vote. For several months that year, the prime minister of Ukraine was also Jewish. No other country except Israel has ever had Jews in the top two posts. There is still anti-Semitism there, of course, directed at the country's roughly 150,000 Jews. But in general, they feel secure. There have been advances in Holocaust commemoration, with a museum planned for Babi Yar, the infamous Nazi killing field outside Kyiv. Jews were highly active in both of the courageous Independence Square or Maidan demonstrations, the one in 2004, known as the Orange Revolution, and the protests in 2013 and 14, in which 100 people were killed by the pro-Russian government's police. The contrary mindset is shown by the filmmaker too, that of the Bolsheviks, strikingly similar to Putin today. One of internal despotism and foreign aggression, and complete disregard for human life. It depends upon misinformation, intimidation, and brutal suppression of dissent. So he can't abide a democracy in Ukraine. In fact, dissenters in Russia, like Alexei Navalny and Boris Nemtsov, they often point to the Ukrainian democracy as an example for their own country, which infuriates Putin more than anything. Which of these two visions will prevail in Ukraine? The sovereign democratic one was co-opted and crushed in 1919. But today, a free Ukraine facing the severest tests is proving itself astonishingly resilient. It must prevail. To send a message to Putin and would-be aggressors around the world, an unprovoked invasion to impose tyranny on another country will exact too high a price. The Bolsheviks' near enslavement of Ukraine, in many respects, set the stage for the rest of the 20th century. Let not the Russian invasion of 2022 set the stage for the rest of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for such a brilliant talk that really gives a great context to the film Anton, which is available at midnight tonight for 5 days. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat function at the bottom of the screen. One question here. Is Zelensky well regarded by the majority of Ukrainians?
Absolutely. There's no question. I mean, if he were to run now, he would get 80, 90% of the vote. There's no question he is admired as a great hero.
Do you know anything more about him in that from someone who was an actor, a comedian, what brought that inner strength, that steel in him?
You know, that's a really good question. And maybe some of you know that he's the Time Magazine Person of the Year. He would have to be, right? There wasn't anyone even close. And if you read that article, I think it answers that question. The people who are friends of his, even family members, they don't see the lighthearted comedian now. They see someone who's very serious and very focused. And what brought him to that was the circumstances. I mean, he saw, you know, a few years ago that his country was really threatened, not only because of that invasion in the eastern part, the Donbass, but also that the Russians were really trying to put in pro-Russian puppets there, you know, in Kyiv to rule the country. And so he and others took a stand. That 2014 protest on the streets of Maidan is an example of that. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Another question from someone. What did Frida see in Trotsky? If he was such a murdering commander in Russia, why would she have, what about him made her presumably fall in love with him?
Because she was a killer also. She was so attracted to Bolshevism that she put everything else aside, and she didn't even see what she was doing in terms of just murdering people. All this telling herself it was for the sake of a better world to come. That's why I'm so interested in this Jewish attraction to this movement. And there she is, literally in bed with Trotsky. And both of them think they're doing a great thing here to change the world.
Why did Trotsky and other Jewish Bolsheviks feel they had to change their name?
Because they didn't, well, there were a couple of things. Remember I mentioned that this kind of Jewish attraction to Bolshevism was a form of assimilation. And so they wanted to be part of the Russian soul. And so if your name was Hirsch Affelbaum, you know, you change it to a Russian name, Grigory Zinoviev, right? And Bronstein changed his name to Trotsky. By the way, there's a kind of a quip that Jews said at the time. The Bronsteins take out the the Trotskys take out the mortgage and the Bronsteins have to pay the bill. In other words, they change their name and they secular Jews, Bolsheviks, they cause all this damage. And then the average Jew is targeted, you know, for being a Bolshevik.
If there aren't any other questions, I want to thank you, Fred. Fred will be